Hello and welcome to today's episode of the Jacksonville Jaguars Insider Podcast. My name is John Shipley. I am your host and beat reporter, and I have been your beat reporter covering the Jacksonville Jaguars for OnSI every single day since August 2019, and we are continuing to push forward through yet another offseason together. All right, folks, welcome to today's episode of the Jacksonville Jaguars Insider Podcast. Today we are talking about the Jake Bobo saga coming to an end. The Seattle Seahawks officially matched the Jaguars' offer sheet for Jake Bobo on Monday, which means that's it. Simply, that's all, folks. The Jaguars will now be moving forward without adding Jake Bobo to the roster. I'll be honest with you guys. I never would have thought that I would write as much or talk as much about Jake Bobo in my life as I have in the last 4 days. That goes to show, I think, just how slow of an offseason this has been for the Jaguars. I mean, when they signed Chris Rodriguez, it was like fireworks went off for Jaguars fans. Just showing that, they had a pulse. And this was obviously, I think, part of that too. Jaguars haven't made many external additions. Well, not many. They've only made one in Rodriguez. And Bobo would have been the second. It was pretty clear what they wanted from Bobo. They saw him as a guy who could fit in as a number 4, number 5 receiver, basically in the Tim Patrick role, make a little bit more money, than Patrick made last year, but he's younger as well. He can, be a big body in the red zone. He's effective as a run blocker. And then, of course, there's what he offers on special teams. There were a lot of reasons for the Jaguars to like Bobo. While I think it would have been a solid addition for them, I also said it. I didn't think it was a game-changing, type situation. This isn't going to dictate their floor or ceiling in 2026. He would have been a nice piece to have, I believe. But it's official. Now the Seattle Seahawks are keeping him, and the Jaguars are not. I would just like to start with, I am fairly surprised that the Seahawks matched the offer sheet. Now, I know his annual, average of the deal on the offer sheet would have been smaller than the 1-year tender he signed in Seattle, but there was more guaranteed money involved in the Jaguars offer sheet. It was a 2-year deal as opposed to a 1-year tender. And this was even before the Seahawks made JSN the highest paid wide receiver in league history, that I was fairly confident that the Seahawks wouldn't match this. By doing so, I mean, the Seahawks now have, a good bit of financial investment in their entire receiver room between JSN, Cooper Kupp, Rashid Shaheed, and now, of course, Jake Bobo. And that was another reason I thought the Seahawks would kind of let him walk. They're spending money on other receivers, even if it's a minimal amount of money. Why not find your number, 4 receiver through a cheaper avenue? That's how I thought the Seahawks would look at it. And then once JSN signed this contract, I thought that was even more the case. I was not expecting the Seahawks to match it, and I was not expecting them to match it just shortly after they backed up the Brinks truck for JSN. Now, the fact that they did obviously shows that they value Bobo quite a bit. So I think that goes to show that the Jaguars, probably made a smart evaluation. They're trying to get a guy that the team is currently on, doesn't want to lose, even if they're having to pay a bit of a bigger price. I think this works out pretty good for Bobo. He stays in a place he's familiar with. He gets more money than he would have gotten on the tender. But for the Jaguars, the question now is, where do they look for their backup receivers? It made sense for them to want to bring in a veteran, even if paying your number 4, number 5 receiver, a couple million might seem maybe a little much. I think it would have been like 23rd, 24th maybe on the Jaguars roster in terms of average annual value. But I think it's pretty obvious that the Jaguars saw a clear role for him. Not just that, but that the Jaguars value that role pretty immensely. I mean, they traded for Tim Patrick last year to put him into that role. Gave up draft capital to get Patrick. That role is obviously, as a bigger receiver, a backup, a guy who can line up on the outside and give them a lot of reps, in the running game, in the red zone. And then even beyond that, I thought Bobo the fact that he adds even more special teams value than I think Patrick does. And Patrick, isn't exactly a slouch on special teams. Would have been a good situation for the Jaguars to land in. So now the Jaguars have to look at other options. Whether it's just through the draft, whether it's through free agency, whatever it is. The Jaguars are clearly looking to add to their receiver room after seeing Tim Patrick and De'Ami Brown walk in free agency. Travis Hunter is also set to play more defense and offense. So bodies are needed at wide receiver. Even with the stellar starting trio and then Hunter that the Jaguars have at receiver, they still need more guys there to take snaps. They still need more guys there to play a sizable role. Thanks to the Jaguars' pursuit of Bobo, though, we now know that they're looking at a very specific skill set potentially for that role. Because that's the thing about restricted free agents and offer sheets. It's not like you're trying to sign a guy in free agency who's an unrestricted free agent where, your offer doesn't have to be made public or anything like that. Teams get 5 days to match restricted free agents. So it becomes public knowledge that, hey, the Jaguars are looking for a receiver. They want Jake Bobo. It's not something that catches anyone by surprise. So as a result of that, we now know that the Jaguars, clearly are looking for a bigger receiver who can block and who adds some special teams value. I think we would have surmised that on our own, just considering what Tim Patrick brought to the table. But the fact they were willing to sign Bobo, to the deal that they offered him, I think shows that they value that spot maybe even more than they anticipated. Tim Patrick played, I think, around 32% of the snaps last year. Didn't put up big numbers, but it was a sizable role considering he wasn't the starter. So who are some candidates to now fill that role now that Bobo is no longer an option? I think you have to consider Tim Patrick first and foremost. You can bring Tim Patrick down on a really small one-year deal of little consequence. You know what you're getting at him. You know what he offers as a blocker. You know what he does in the passing game. Is he the most explosive pass catcher? No. His best days running or behind him. I do think, though, that, for the very niche and specific role the Jaguars have in mind, he'd be a quality add. With that said, I do wonder if they saw more upside in Bobo as a receiver. And say, for instance, Brian Thomas Jr. or Jacoby Myers missed time at some point in the season. I could have seen them slotting Bobo, in there. Patrick, I'm not sure. I think potentially they add him, that they were still looking for other guys just because, like I said, he's not the most dynamic receiver. He's always been a big-bodied, possession, contested catch guy. But he's obviously, lost some speed as he's progressed throughout his NFL career, which happens to every receiver. I think, though, that Patrick, he knows the offense, which is, as everybody knows, a tough offense to pick up. He knows the fact that Liam Cohen wants this specific receiver to play a very specific role. He seemed to embrace that role last season. Seemed to really embrace, especially the blocking aspect of it. And like I said, it's the devil as opposed to the one you don't know. I think that getting a guy like Patrick back would make a lot of sense for the Jaguars. And it also wouldn't stop them, I'd imagine, from adding somebody else. Lastly, there's no chance it would cost them in the comp pick formula because he's one of their own free agents. They want to keep looking at veterans. I think Noah Brown is a guy who makes sense. He's 6'2". He's played special teams before, 8-year veteran. Only played in 4 games for Washington last year, but had about 400, something receiving yards the year before. Doesn't have a ton of juice to his game, but would have been somebody who I think would have made sense for the specific role the Jaguars are seeking out. Tyler Johnson's another one. He actually spent 2 seasons with the Rams, so James Gladstone has some familiarity. He's another big receiver. He graded out well as a run blocker last year, according to PFF. And, he can give you a couple hundred yards off the bench. So I think the Jaguars certainly have options at the receiver spot. But I also think that they were looking forward to the idea of landing, Bobo as their top backup receiver. And now, as a result, the Seahawks matching the offer. they will be looking elsewhere.